She spilled red wine on a billionaire's white soutane. He hired her the same night. That's the shocking moment that sets everything in motion. What started as a humiliating accident at a luxury gala soon unravels into a tangled web of family secrets, silent power games, and a hidden past that threatens to rewrite everything she thought she knew about herself. Before we dive into this whirlwind of betrayal and legacy, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Claire Thompson had always believed there were two kinds of people in the world, those who served champagne and those who drank it. At 27, she was firmly in the first group. Raised by her single mother in the grit of Newark's working-class neighborhoods, Claire grew up scrubbing floors and dodging eviction notices, not mingling under crystal chandeliers. Yet on that night, beneath the vaulted ceilings of the Metropolitan Museum, she found herself balancing a tray of Dom Perignon among silk gowns and tailored tuxedos, praying nothing would go wrong. But fate is cruel and never subtle. A misstep, a slipper heel catching a cable, a glass tipping. In a split second, rich red liquid cascaded over the brilliant white of a custom Tom Ford suit. The room froze. The victim, Miles Rutherford, 3, New York's most eligible bachelor, heir to the Rutherford fortune, and the living embodiment of old money arrogance. His gaze dropped slowly to the stain, and the silence was thunderous. Claire's heart pounded. She stammered an apology, voice cracking, eyes stinging. Around them, titters erupted, quiet, cruel laughter from those born immune to consequence. Then came the unexpected. Miles smiled, not a warm smile, a calculating, amused curl of the lips. "Well," he said with exaggerated poise, brushing a crimson droplet off his cuff, "I guess the ice is broken." The crowd laughed louder, this time with him. Then, with a wave of theatrical charm, he turned to Claire. "You're hired," he announced. "My new personal assistant starting tomorrow." The room gasped. A few applauded. Others exchanged looks of suspicion and disdain. Claire, still reeling, nodded dumbly. What else could she do? She needed money. Her temp work barely covered rent, and her mother's medical debts were piling up. But the offer felt like a trap she was stepping into with both feet. That night, Claire stood on the steps of a mansion she never dreamed she'd see up close. The Rutherford estate in East Hampton was more fortress than home, its high gates and marble facade whispering secrets even before she crossed the threshold. Her job, as explained by a stiff, precise secretary, would include scheduling meetings, sorting correspondence, and occasionally attending private dinners. It sounded simple. It wasn't. Miles was charming, but in a way that felt rehearsed. He moved through his home like a king among staff, never raising his voice, but always commanding attention. His siblings, Gregory and Caroline, barely concealed their disdain. Gregory's handshake was a vice, his smile tight and cold. Caroline simply glanced at Claire like one might glance at a cracked vase, something that didn't belong and might stain the rug. Claire tried to stay invisible, but Miles wouldn't allow that. He insisted she sit in meetings, even when they had nothing to do with her tasks. He asked for her opinion on matters of corporate strategy. He invited her to lunch, 2 receptions, 2 wine tastings with people who looked at her as if she were a novelty from another world. She played the role pullet, composed but inside. She was always counting the steps to the nearest exit. Then, late one rainy night, Claire wandered into the library. Miles was away. The staff had retired. Alone among shelves of leather-bound history, she pulled out a dusty volume, and a box tumbled free from behind it. Inside, letters, dozens, yellowed paper, delicate ink, all signed by her mother, Elizabeth Thompson. She read them one by one, heart-pounding. They were addressed to Jonathan Rutherford, Miles's father. The tone was intimate, affectionate, tortured. One letter mentioned their baby, her baby. The final one spoke of an ultimatum, then silence. At the bottom of the box, a photo of her mother, young and glowing, pregnant. Claire felt the floor shift beneath her. The world she had tried to keep at arm's length was now written in her own DNA. It explained everything: Miles's interest, the sudden job, the way he watched her, not with curiosity, but with calculation. She was not just a mistake he wanted to fix. She was a piece on his chessboard, and she had never even known she was in the game. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in the guest room, lavish and impersonal, and stared at the box of letters until dawn. When Miles returned the next morning, she was waiting for him. He didn't act surprised. He listened to her accusations without interruption. Then, with that same dispassionate smile, he confirmed it all. Yes, he knew. Yes, Jonathan had confessed on his deathbed. Yes, Claire was legally entitled to a share of the inheritance. And yes, he had brought her into the mansion not out of generosity, but to determine whether she could help him consolidate power against Gregory and Caroline. She was, in his words, a unique strategic asset. Claire walked out without saying a word. In the days that followed, she packed in silence, ignored Miles's calls, and reached out to Walter Kent, her mother's old friend and former legal advisor. He lived quietly now in a humble apartment in Hoboken, but the moment he saw the letters, he knew exactly what they meant. He confirmed she had grounds for a legal claim, but he also asked the question that stuck with her more than anything else. Do you want justice, or do you want revenge? She didn't answer. She didn't know. That night, Claire walked through the old streets of Newark, past diners where she'd once worked double shifts, past the school where her mother taught ESL classes. Every step was a return to something, real something solid. Not marble halls or crystal chandeliers, just cracked sidewalks and warm coffee and faces that didn't pretend. She realized something then. Miles hadn't pulled her into his world. Her story had always been part of theirs. But what she did next, that was hers alone to decide. The Rutherford mansion in East Hampton was nothing like Claire remembered from her brief stay. Now that she knew the truth, every corner echoed with deception. It wasn't just the opulence or the silence that unsettled her, it was the way the entire estate seemed to be watching her. She returned not as a servant, not as a guest, but as a rightful heir who hadn't yet decided whether to claim the throne. Miles welcomed her back with practiced charm, offering a glass of wine as though nothing had changed. She declined, standing stiffly as he explained her new role: full access to family records, discretion over internal affairs. A temporary advisor on matters concerning Rutherford Enterprises, but this time, Claire wasn't listening to his words. She was watching his eyes, scanning for signs of manipulation. Her days began early and ended late, spent sifting through decades of files that chronicled the rise of the Rutherford Empire. There were mergers, lawsuits, land deals, and hush money payouts, all meticulously cataloged. The real story of the family was one of ruthless control masked as legacy. Claire took notes, not for revenge, not yet, but because knowledge was her only real power. She began piecing together a pattern, especially regarding Gregory, whose legal dealings hinted at far more than aggressive lawyering. Several cases involving embezzlement and asset redirection had quietly vanished. Claire flagged them and made copies. Caroline, meanwhile, drifted through the halls like a ghost wrapped in silk. She didn't speak to Claire directly, but made sure to be heard. Snide remarks floated from her lips like perfume. Family members, whispers about Claire's background, digs at her Newark accent when she spoke on calls. Claire didn't respond. She was done defending her place. She knew now that blood wasn't enough to make her one of them, but it was more than enough to break their illusion of control. Miles kept his distance publicly, but privately he sought her out always under the pretense of collaboration. He wanted her insight on Gregory's weaknesses, asked her to accompany him to board meetings, insisted that the company could be stronger if led by those with integrity. Claire almost laughed. Integrity was not a currency Miles traded, and she played along, pretending to consider his alliance while quietly building her own case. Then came the envelope. It arrived in her room late one evening, unmarked. Inside was a photo, grainy, taken from a distance, but unmistakable. It showed Gregory meeting with a known corporate fixer outside a private airfield. Attached was a document linking him to a Cayman Islands account and several falsified trust funds. Claire brought the evidence to Walter, who confirmed the legality of pursuing a corporate fraud claim, but the deeper issue was timing. Any move Claire made would have to be fast, precise, and impossible to trace back to her. She returned to the mansion, her decision made. She would no longer wait for justice to arrive in courtrooms or settlements. If Miles had wanted her to be a player, she'd be one, but on her terms. She confronted Gregory directly, in the smoking lounge where he spent most evenings pretending to read the Wall Street Journal. She laid out the documents in front of him, calmly, and said only, "If I go down, I'll drag you with me." He paled, but said nothing. The next morning he left the estate for a legal conference in Chicago. He didn't return. Caroline was next. Claire didn't need evidence, just leverage. She invited her to tea, which in itself sent a shockwave through the household. Caroline arrived late, armed with icy disapproval. Claire poured the tea and handed her a single sheet, a list of expenses linked to charity funds that Caroline had, redirected for personal use. At the bottom, a note: "The media would love to see this." Caroline didn't speak for nearly a full minute. Then she folded the paper, placed it in her purse, and left without another word. Claire knew this wasn't over. These were only skirmishes in a larger war. Miles, as always, remained silent to silent. He hadn't confronted her, hadn't tried to stop her. It was almost as if he wanted her to clean house. That night, she went to the West Wing, where Jonathan's private study had been sealed since his death. With help from Walter and a court order quietly executed through family lawyers, she entered. Inside, everything was untouched: ledgers, handwritten notes, audio tapes from board meetings. It was a vault of Lagosian lies. Among the clutter, she found a leather-bound journal. It wasn't Jonathan's, it was Miles's, hidden behind old photo albums. Inside were pages of detailed psychological observations on her. Descriptions of their first meeting, her reaction to the wine incident, her facial expressions during family dinners. It was a record of manipulation, of calculation. She realized then that nothing had been spontaneous, not the job offer, not the closeness, not even the supposed confessions about their fathers. She was never an ally. She was a subject in an experiment. The next morning she confronted him in the garden. He was trimming hedges, of all things, as though he were just another man tending to a home. She threw the journal at his feet and waited. Miles didn't flinch. He picked it up, dusted the cover, and met her gaze. "You wanted truth," he said. "That's mine. I don't lie. I just don't stop others from believing what they want." Claire walked away, her heart pounding, not with fear, but with clarity. He didn't regret his actions. He didn't think he'd lost. He thought he'd made her stronger, and maybe in a way he had. Claire was no longer the woman who spilled wine at a gala. She wasn't the waitress from Newark. She wasn't even the daughter of Elizabeth and Jonathan. She was something new, something that didn't need anyone's approval to exist. That evening, she packed a bag and left the mansion without saying goodbye. She didn't need to slam a door to make her exit felt. Back in Newark, Claire sat in her apartment, surrounded by boxes of files and letters. She opened her laptop, began organizing everything: the fraud records, the journal entries, the legal filings. It was time to take the final step, not for vengeance, but to finish what her mother had been denied. She would expose the truth, not in the courts or in boardrooms, but in the only place that mattered, the public eye. And when it was all over, she would disappear again, not because she had to. Claire didn't wait for permission. Within 48 hours of leaving the Rutherford mansion, she initiated legal proceedings to challenge the family estate's line of succession. Her attorney, Walter, helped her file a petition for recognition of paternity based on the DNA samples Jonathan Rutherford had left at a private clinic. They moved quickly, quietly, bypassing the media and avoiding confrontation until the documents were airtight. While the Rutherford lawyers scrambled to suppress the story, Claire stayed hidden in Newark, operating from a cramped apartment filled with case files and backup drives. She wasn't chasing headlines or magazine covers. She was preparing for war. But war has a way of finding you first. Gregory returned from his so-called conference and immediately went on the offensive. He didn't attack Claire through the courts. He tried to discredit her mother. Anonymous emails began circulating among key shareholders, suggesting Elizabeth Thompson had been a manipulative opportunist who seduced Jonathan during a mental health crisis. Claire knew it was Gregory behind it, but the smear campaign was working. Stockholders hesitated. Board members began whispering. Miles stayed disturbingly quiet, neither defending Claire nor denying the accusations. It was clear he was letting his brother destroy her credibility. Perhaps to keep his own hands clean, Claire responded not with press conferences, but with documents. Walter drafted a countersuit, and they released letters and photographs, indisputable proof of a long-term relationship between Elizabeth and Jonathan. More than that, Claire authorized the release of a statement through an independent firm, confirming her DNA match. The media caught wind, and for the first time, headlines read, "Illegitimate daughter of Jonathan Rutherford demands justice," a narrative Claire never asked for, but one she could use. Within days, her story was everywhere. Some anchors painted her as the underdog. Others called her a gold digger. It didn't matter. The court set a date. The paternity case was moving forward, and once the DNA match was confirmed, Claire would become a legal heir. The Rutherford empire would no longer be fully controlled by the family who had kept her mother in the shadows. That was the goal, nothing more. But power, once challenged, doesn't yield quietly. Miles finally reached out, not with apologies or explanations, but with a dinner invitation, discreet, private, on neutral ground. Against her better judgment, Claire went. He greeted her in a quiet restaurant near Central Park. No press, no bodyguards, just him, the smile she now knew too well, and a wine glass she didn't touch. He spoke of the family name, the weight of legacy, the damage public. The spectacle could do. He offered her a deal, full recognition, a generous share of the estate, a seat on the board, all in exchange for silence. No lawsuits, no press, no more public drama. Claire looked him in the eye and said no, not because of pride or revenge, but because the deal was never about peace, it was about control. She left him sitting alone at that table, swirling his wine like a man who just realized the storm was real. In the weeks that followed, the court ordered the release of Jonathan's DNA samples. The match was 99.99%. Claire Thompson was legally, biologically, undeniably his daughter. Miles didn't contest the results. Gregory, furious and cornered, filed an injunction to delay the inheritance claim, but it was denied. Caroline, whose own scandals had begun leaking, vanished from public view entirely. The structure of the Rutherford dynasty was beginning to crack, and Claire's name was now engraved into its foundation. But the fallout wasn't just legal. Claire's face was on every screen. She couldn't leave her apartment without paparazzi. Friends she hadn't heard from in years began calling. Former colleagues from catering gigs tried to cash in with tabloids, selling half-truths about her past. She didn't respond. She moved quietly to a small apartment under a different name, kept working with Walter, and started to dismantle the real Threat Rutherford Enterprises itself in her late father's files. She found evidence that the company had funneled money through a shell corporation connected to foreign investments. It wasn't illegal, but it was unethically enough to rattle shareholders. Claire used it strategically. She called a press meeting not to vilify anyone, but to demand transparency. She stated plainly, "This isn't about inheritance. It's about accountability. If the company that carries my father's name continues to betray the people it claims to serve, then it has no right to operate." That single statement did what lawsuits couldn't. It forced the board to meet. Investors started pulling out. Miles, sensing a corporate collapse, made a desperate move. He resigned temporarily, framing it as a noble act to protect the company's image. But Claire knew it was self-preservation. With him gone and Gregory and Caroline under scrutiny, the empire had no face left. The media pivoted, no longer hounding Claire, but treating her as the woman who stood up against one of the oldest dynasties in New York. Yet Claire didn't feel like a victor. She sat one night on the fire escape of her temporary apartment, watching the city lights flicker. She thought about her mother, about the quiet strength she'd carried, about how she'd shielded Claire from all of this, not out of shame, but to give her daughter a chance at a life untouched by this madness. Claire had walked willingly into the fire, and now that the world knew her name, she wasn't sure who she was anymore. Walter visited the next day with a stack of legal documents. Claire was now listed as a shareholder. Not majority, not controlling, but present. Her name was carved into the marble she once served drinks beneath. She signed the paperwork without ceremony, then asked him quietly, "What now?" Walter, always calm, simply said, "Now you decide what you want to build." And for the first time in months, Claire realized she had no idea. She had reached the summit of the mountain she didn't ask to climb. She had uncovered the truth, burned the lies, and exposed the machine. But revenge hadn't brought peace. It had brought space, and in that space, she now had to find purpose. So she made a quiet decision. No more lawsuits, no interviews, no memoirs. She rented a modest studio. She enrolled in a literature program. She told no one when the media came knocking. She let the silent speak. When investors tried to pull her into meetings, she declined. When Miles sent a handwritten letter offering another Truchet, didn't even read it. She folded it once, tucked it into a book of poetry her mother once loved, and left it on the shelf. Claire Thompson didn't win by taking over the empire. She won by stepping away from it. And in doing so, she became something the Rutherfords had never known how to be. Claire's silence became her weapon. While the media spun endless narratives about her inheritance and the fall of the Rutherford legacy, she remained invisible, refusing to speak or even appear in public. Her absence created a vacuum that neither Miles nor the crumbling board of Rutherford Enterprises could fill. Shareholders, once loyal to the family name, began questioning leadership. The company's stock wavered. Rumors surfaced that key investors were looking to withdraw. Claire, meanwhile, attended her night classes, walked through bookstores unnoticed, and focused on rebuilding a life where she wasn't defined by bloodlines or boardroom wars. But even in retreat, Claire remained a threat. A threat not because she wanted power, but because she'd proven she didn't need it. Her refusal to play the game had exposed everyone else's desperation to cling to the rules. Walter continued to handle the legal loose ends property claims, final court affirmations, but Claire gave him clear instructions. No appearances, no interviews, no statements. Let the records speak. Let them all twist in the quiet. She kept the money she was owed but declined the bonuses and stock packages. The company tried to hand her like hush money. Every time she said no, the press grew more obsessed, and the Rutherfords more afraid. Miles broke the silence first. He sent a letter not through lawyers, not through staff, but handwritten, as if trying to reclaim a piece of his soul. In it, he called Claire a necessary correction to a history that had grown too comfortable with its own myth. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't ask for anything. He merely offered a dinner. Claire didn't answer. She didn't need more words from him. She needed time, distance, peace. For weeks, the world spun without her in it. The headlines moved on. A new scandal, a new billionaire falling. Claire walked past newsstands without flinching. Then the company cracked. Internal audits, spurred by Claire's earlier disclosures, uncovered years of mismanagement. Caroline was implicated in misusing charity funds. Gregory was tied to offshore accounts. Both were subpoenaed. Miles, though not formally charged, was dragged into the mess by proximity. His temporary leave became indefinite. The Rutherford name lost its shimmer. Business magazines that once praised its lineage now ran exposes on its internal rot. Through it all, Claire said nothing. She read, she wrote, she listened to the hum of a world that no longer owned her. One afternoon, while organizing old family papers, Claire found a document she hadn't noticed before, an unsigned letter from Jonathan Rutherford to Elizabeth, never mailed. In it, he admitted everything. His failure to stand up to his family, his regret at hiding Claire's existence, his hope that one day she'd find her own path. It was the closest thing to a confession he'd ever made. She read it twice, then folded it into a journal without a tear. Closure didn't always arrive in grand moments. Sometimes it came as a sentence written decades too late. Around this time, Walter received a strange phone call from a boutique firm in London representing an anonymous trust. The caller claimed that Claire had been left a private property. Separate from any inheritance battles, it was a townhouse in the West Village, untouched for years, fully paid, legally transferred. No names, just documents. Claire suspected Miles. It fit his style grand gestures disguised as anonymous philanthropy. She considered rejecting it outright, but something made her visit. The place was old, charming, silent. No staff, no eyes, watching just walls, wood, and windows facing a tree-lined street. It wasn't a gift. It felt like a message. Here's what you could have if you want it. She moved in without ceremony. No photos, no press. She carried her boxers in herself, one at a time. The neighbors didn't recognize her. She introduced herself as Claire. No last name, no story. The woman next door offered pie. A man upstairs fixed her doorbell. Nobody asked who she was or where. She came from for the first time in months. She slept through the night without checking the locks. In that townhouse, she began to write not about the Rutherfords, not about betrayal or power, but about a woman who chose silence over vengeance, clarity over chaos. But the story wasn't done with her yet. One morning, a legal courier arrived, with documents demanding Claire's presence at a closed-door shareholders meeting. Gregory was attempting a final maneuver to reinstate himself on the board, claiming Claire's silence proved her disinterest and made her a liability. Miles, still technically absent, hadn't intervened. The board was split, Walter advised, against attending, but Claire knew it was time to end it. She arrived alone, without lawyers, without notes. The room went silent when she entered. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She simply stated, "I'm not here to take control. I'm here to remind you that some of us don't need to." Then she handed over a final package records showing Gregory's most recent manipulations traced to shell accounts he assumed were erased. Faces went pale. Gregory stood, tried to speak, but was shut down by the chairman. The vote was taken. Gregory was expelled. Caroline's position remained suspended. Miles, still silent, sent a short message via counsel. No objection. Claire left the building and didn't look back. That night, she returned to her new home, lit a candle, opened a book of her mother's poetry, and placed Jonathan's old letter inside. The wind outside had changed. No more threats, no more whispers. Just the quiet of a chapter closing, the kind no one reads aloud, but everyone remembers. Claire's victory didn't come with confetti or applause. It came with silence, deep, satisfying, irreversible. With Gregory expelled and Caroline shamed into withdrawal, the Rutherford dynasty was officially disarmed. Miles, once the master of every room he entered, had become a name attached to cautionary tales in financial journals. And yet, Claire didn't feel triumphant. She felt still. For the first time, her life wasn't about survival or strategy. It was about choice. She could walk down a street without hearing whispers. She could drink coffee without calculating exits. She had a home no one could take and a name no one could twist. Her war was over, but peace has its own challenges. With no enemies to outmaneuver and no fires to put out, Claire was left with the question that had haunted her ever since the truth about her father surfaced. Who was she outside the conflict? She no longer needed to prove her worth, nor defend her mother's memory. The empire that once tried to bury her now stood weakened because she chose to stand tall. So she turned inward. She declined every media request, ignored lucrative offers for book deals and documentaries, and instead volunteered at a community literacy program downtown. She taught reading to women trying to escape cycles she understood too well. She said little about herself, but the quiet strength in her voice gave others courage. That was enough. Walter remained her only link to the legal world. He visited weekly, not as a lawyer, but as a friend. They talked about literature, about her students, about nothing in particular. During one of their walks, he told her the last pieces of the estate were finally in her control. She could now do anything: invest, sell, build. Claire thanked him, but didn't act. The money sat untouched. The townhouse was enough. She had everything she needed. Power, once alluring, had become irrelevant. She didn't want to become what she fought against. She wanted her life back. Then came the letter. No courier, no signature, just an envelope slid under her door. Inside, a single sheet of paper with familiar handwriting. Miles, he had left. The country, he was in Greece, possibly for good. He wrote that watching the empire fall was like witnessing the collapse of a house he knew was built on sand. He confessed that he had admired her not for her defiance, but for her restraint. She had every reason to destroy him publicly, but chose silence. You understood the difference between justice and spectacle. I never did. There was no plea, no address, no return, just a goodbye. Claire folded the letter and burned it in the fireplace, not out of anger, but as ritual, a final cleansing of the last thread that tied her to that world. In the days that followed, she rearranged her bookshelves, updated her voter registration, and hosted a small gathering with her students. There was no mention of wealth, of Rutherfords, of scandals. They laughed, shared food, recited poems no one asked. Where she came from, she had finally become just Claire. But history doesn't let go so easily. One morning she saw her face in the background of a news segment. The anchor mentioned her only briefly, but it was enough to start the cycle again. Tabloids speculated about her next move. Online forums debated whether she would take over the Rutherford brand. Some even suggested she was secretly rebuilding the company under a different name. Claire ignored it all. She walked the same streets, went to the same bookstore, lived the same life. The noise would fade. It always did, until it didn't. A new scandal broke one, involving international investors and misappropriated legacy funds. Though Claire had nothing to do with it, her name was attached through corporate lineage. Calls flooded Walter's office. Reporters waited outside her building. Her students were questioned. Claire watched as her life, so carefully rebuilt, began to fracture under pressure she never asked for. She met with Walter, who suggested issuing a statement. Claire refused. "I'm not defending a name I never chose," she said. "Let them chase ghosts, but ghosts have reach." An old board member threatened litigation, claiming Claire's silence was deliberate obfuscation. Rumors of a private settlement surfaced. Claire responded by releasing one document: her formal resignation from any position connected to the Rutherford enterprise. No claim, no power, no ties. She gave up everything except her dignity. It shocked the media. They called it a betrayal. A scandal? A mystery? Claire didn't explain. She didn't need to. Those who understood didn't ask. Those who didn't never would. As the story died down again, Claire walked one evening to the park near the river. It was quiet. The wind was cold. She stood by the water and thought of her mother, of her warmth, her laughter, her strength. Elizabeth Thompson had never asked for fame or revenge. She only wanted truth. And Claire had delivered that, not with rage, but with patience. She sat on a bench and watched the sun disappear behind the city. A boy played nearby, laughing. A woman called him to dinner. Life went on, unbothered by headlines. Unimpressed by legacy, Claire stayed until the stars appeared. Then she walked home, locked the door, made tea, and wrote a letter not to anyone. Just to herself. She wrote about silence, about victory, about the cost of both. Then she folded the letter, placed it in a drawer, and turned off the light. There was nothing left to prove. And that, finally, was freedom. The collapse of the Rutherford Empire didn't happen with a bang. It eroded slowly, like a statue losing its shape under decades of wind. The corporation that bore their name became a hollow shell. Board members resigned in quiet waves, investors withdrew, and employees scrambled for stability as the brand that once defined American wealth was stripped of its mystique. Business news outlets, once reverent, now dissected every flaw with surgical precision. Her image, poised and unreadable, often appeared in retrospectives as the turning point, the woman who undid a dynasty. But Claire didn't pay attention. She had reclaimed her anonymity with discipline. To notice something she hadn't expected, peace came with emptiness, the kind that crept in during long, quiet evenings, or when her students asked about her before life with curious, innocent eyes. What does a person do when their purpose has already been fulfilled? One cold afternoon, Claire received a package with no return address. Between the pages, a letter. Miles. No explanation. She placed the book on her shelf beside the others and went about her day. But the gesture lingered like the smell of smoke after a fire. His family's assets, real estate, shares, art collections, and retreated to a quiet town along the Mediterranean coast. Reports claimed he lived in a modest villa and refused interviews. Some said he'd found peace. He was erasing the legacy he once fought to control, but the damage was done. The name Rutherford, once synonymous with power, now echoed like a cautionary tale whispered in finance seminars. Then came an unexpected call from a small publishing house interested in Claire's volunteer work. One of her students had anonymously submitted a collection of her lesson materials and short stories she'd written to inspire discussions. They wanted to publish it. She hesitated, wary of the spotlight, but the editor promised discretion. No memoirs, no headlines. Just a book about resilience and learning. Claire agreed, under the condition her full name not be used. She watched the process unfold quietly, correcting proofs, choosing paper stock, approving cover designs with a calm detachment. Modest success, mostly in schools, libraries, and community centers. But reviews praised its honesty, its simplicity, its quiet strength. Some readers speculated about the author's identity. but the mystery only added to the appeal. Claire didn't claim credit. She didn't need to. She had finally created something untouched by the Rutherford curse, something purely hers. Then, in early spring, a legal letter arrived. A law firm representing a European foundation was requesting her appearance at a private estate settlement. The deceased, it turned out, was a reclusive art collector who had once been close to Jonathan Rutherford. Claire had never met him. Yet he'd left her a piece of property in Tuscany, a villa surrounded by olive trees. Walter verified everything. The gift was legal, unconditional, and entirely hers. Claire considered ignoring it. She didn't need more gifts tied to the past. But Walter urged her to see it differently. Sometimes, he said, you inherit things not because of who you are, but because of who they hoped you'd become. So she traveled, not as an heiress, not as a name in a scandal. Weathered stone, sun-bleached terraces, silence that hummed with history. She stayed for a week, then two, into a life that had nothing to do with legacy or headlines, just time, space, and breath. Eventually, she stopped counting the days altogether. Back in New York, the world moved on. The Rutherford name vanished from the stock exchange. Buildings were renamed, articles faded from front pages. Claire's townhouse remained empty, dust collected on shelves, mail piled at the door. But neighbors didn't worry. She had told them she was traveling. One of her students continued teaching her class. The city didn't notice her absence. Hers, it wasn't Jonathan's. It belonged to the collector, the man who had gifted her the property. One passage stood out. We all build empires, some with steel, some with silence, but only the ones built on kindness survive us. She read the sentence again, then copied it into her own notebook. Claire sat by the window as the sun set behind the hills. There was no need to return to New York. There was no war left to fight. She had inherited a battlefield, turned it into a library, and now, perhaps, into a home. It had been laid to rest, not with thunder, but with a whisper and Claire. Once the girl who spilled wine on power had rewritten her story entirely. Not for revenge, not for headlines, but for peace. The seasons shifted gently over the hills of Tuscany, and Claire remained untouched by time's usual demands. In the villa, she found a rhythm that didn't obey the chaos of her past early mornings with ink-stained fingers. Long walks between olive groves, evenings wrapped in silence and books. She didn't speak often to anyone outside the small village, and they respected that. Her name wasn't known here, not in the way it had once been. To the locals, she was just the quiet American woman in the stone house who always tipped well and never asked for attention. She blended into the landscape as if she had been born from it, and perhaps, in some way, she had reborn at least from the ashes of the life she left behind. Her days were simple, but her thoughts were not. She began writing more seriously now, for publication, not to prove anything, but to make sense of the endless shifts in identity she'd endured. The girl from Newark, the accidental assistant, the illegitimate daughter, the woman who brought down a dynasty. None of it fit anymore, but all of it was true. She didn't try to resolve the contradiction. She wrote about it instead, building layered characters with quiet pasts and loud secrets. Pages turned into chapters, chapters into volumes. She never called it a novel, but anyone who read it would have seen the story of a woman who chose silence over spectacle and still changed. Everything then. One spring morning, a letter arrived. No signature again, just the same careful handwriting that had once haunted and later intrigued her. Miles, the envelope contained a single page. There's nothing left to control, Claire, it read. No inheritance, no image, no empire. Just this. I wake up every morning in a place where no one knows my name, and it terrifies me. But maybe that's what you always understood, that being unknown is its own kind of freedom. She didn't respond. She didn't burn this one either. She placed it between the pages of a book he'd once given her, unread and unfinished, and returned it to the shelf. What followed wasn't closure. Claire had long abandoned the idea that pain resolved cleanly, but a sense of completion. Miles had finally admitted what she always knew, that he was never the ruler of the empire, only its most desperate servant. Without the family name to shield him, he had become like anyone else, and he didn't know how to live like that. Claire, by contrast, had learned. She had rebuilt herself in obscurity, and found that it suited her better than legacy ever did. She didn't need an audience. Her life wasn't a performance anymore. Months later, the publishing house that released her collection reached out again. They wanted to reprint it under her real name, now that the media had moved on and the scandal was considered ancient history. Claire declined, not because she feared the spotlight, but because she knew that anonymity was not a mascot, was a sanctuary. She wasn't hiding. She was protecting the one thing that had cost her everything to reclaim, her own narrative. Let the world forget. Let the story end quietly. That was the point all along. In autumn, the village held a festival, and Claire was invited to read something. At first, she refused. But then she remembered her mother, how she used to read poetry aloud in their tiny kitchen, how her voice made even sorrow sound like strength. So Claire chose one of her pieces, a quiet reflection on grief, love, and the way history folds us into itself without permission. She read it beneath an archway lit by lanterns, to a crowd that didn't know her history and didn't care. When she finished, they clapped gently. No one asked for a signature. No one snapped a photo. They simply thanked her. She returned to the villa under a sky freckled with stars, her steps light. She had never planned for this life. She had never envisioned a future that didn't involve conflict. But peace, it turned out, didn't need to be planned. It just needed to be chosen. Every day, Claire chose it again. Not because it was easy, because it was right. She spent the winter renovating the villa's third-floor library, installing stronger lighting and cataloging the forgotten books that had gathered dust for decades. It was the kind of work no one would ever see, and yet it felt urgent and necessary. In those shelves, in those pages, she found voices that had survived wars, scandals, revolutions. It reminded her that the loudest stories weren't always the most enduring. The quiet ones, the ones whispered in solitude, often outlived everything else. And in the quietest hours of the night, when the world was still, she sometimes found herself thinking of Miles, not with longing or bitterness, but with the clarity of someone who had walked away from a fire and never looked back. She wondered if he still sent letters to no one, if he still struggled to live without someone watching, and she hoped, in a distant and forgiving part of her heart, that he had found some measure of what she had found, not peace, perhaps, but stillness, a life without applause. A life where silence wasn't punishment, it was grace. Claire didn't know what the future held, and she no longer needed to. There would be no headlines announcing her next step, no cameras following her into bookstores. She had let go of a name that once held the world in awe, and discovered that her own name, spoken in solitude. On the morning, Claire decided to stop writing. There was no particular revelation. The sun crept into the villa through shutters she had forgotten to close, casting soft, fractured light over the wooden floor. A breeze slipped in from the terrace, stirring the edge of a page she had left open the night before. She rose slowly, barefoot, and watched as the olive trees shifted outside. A song that had already faded, but left its echo in the air. She didn't feel sad. She felt whole, and that surprised her more than anything else. In the kitchen, she brewed coffee and placed the worn notebook on the counter. She flipped through the pages without urgency, pausing occasionally at something underlined, something that once seemed urgent. Now they were just pieces, not unfinished, not abandoned, just lived through. There were no final lines, no declarations, no clear ending, just a pause that felt right. She tucked the notebook into the top drawer beside the letters she never mailed, the passports she never used, and closed it with a softness that had taken years to earn. Later that day, the woman who sold figs greeted her with a warm smile and handed her a small paper bag without waiting for payment. A man asked if she would help catalog the books at the school next week. She agreed without overthinking it. These were the new threads of her life, not stitched by blood, not bound by name, just formed by the quiet, repeated act of showing up. Inside, just a slim paperback, her book, reissued in another language, its cover plain and elegant. She ran her fingers over the unfamiliar letters and placed it on a low shelf without ceremony. There were no tears. Recognition was no longer a currency she chased. Let the story travel. Let her stay still. That evening, she lit a fire and read until the wood turned to embers. Book in her lap, smiling at something outside the frame. Claire had never asked what, and now she never would. But the smile had always been enough. She carried that expression in her own quiet gestures, now in the way she folded towels, watered plants, answered softly. She hadn't become her mother, but she had inherited her steadiness. That legacy was never contested, never documented, never broken. Occasionally, she still received letters. Fewer now, some from old classmates, others from readers, one or two from names she recognized but chose not to revisit. She didn't reply often. The last letter she received from Miles came a few days before Christmas. It was just a postcard with an image of a stone chapel on a cliffside. There were no more questions left between them. On New Year's Eve, Claire took a long walk. The night was clear, the stars indifferent but generous in their presence. She reached the hilltop where wildflowers grew in spring and stood there until the bells from the village church marked midnight. She didn't make resolutions. She didn't look back. She breathed. Then she walked home quietly, without urgency. Months later, a friend from the village asked if she would speak to a group of students visiting from abroad. They were studying literature. Some of them had read her work and they wanted to meet. Her Claire hesitated but agreed. When she entered the room, the students were already seated, notebooks open. One of them raised a hand before she had even sat down. "How did you decide what parts of your story to tell?" "Own way to remain." There was a long pause, and then the room filled with scribbling pens, but Claire didn't elaborate. To be spelled out, some truths are carried in the way a person moves, or in the way they choose to stay. That evening, as the sun dipped low again, Claire stood by her window with a cup of tea. Across the field, a dog barked, a door creaked open, and laughter from a dinner table floated faintly on the wind. She closed her eyes and let it all pass through her. No one would write about this moment. No one would record it. And yet, it would remain. Because some endings don't need to be written there, simply lived.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Your support helps us grow and bring you even more amazing content. See you in the next one.